Welcome to Category Visionaries, the show dedicated to exploring exciting visions for the future from the founders who are on the front lines building it. In each episode, we'll speak with a visionary founder who's building a new category or reimagining an existing one. We'll learn about the problem they solve, how their technology works, and unpack their vision for the future. I'm your host, Brett Stapper, CEO of Frontlines Media. Now let's dive right into today's episode. Hey, founders, and thanks for listening. Today, I'm speaking with Kameale C, CEO and co-founder of ChargerHelp, an EV infrastructure solution that raised over $20 million in funding. Kameale, thanks for chatting with me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Not a problem. I'm really excited for this conversation. I'd love to kick off with a little bit more about who you are and your background.
Sure. Kameale. I'm from South Central Los Angeles, born to two Belizean parents. One parent was an entrepreneur. And funny enough, I said I would never be an entrepreneur until I discovered a really interesting problem in the EV charging space. So I am tackling reliability management for EV charging stations. And I've been doing it since January of 2020.
How did you uncover this problem in the first place? And what was about this problem that made you say, all right, I didn't want to be an entrepreneur, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to dive in.
Yeah, so I used to work for a company that made software for EV charging stations. I was the 10th employee there and had the really cool opportunity to grow with that company. But not even funny enough, just crazy. My mom, got diagnosed with cancer for I'm going to say the second or third time there was a reoccurrence. And so I ended up leaving that company and was actually just creating a curriculum on how to fix charging stations, in my spare time, because that's what people should do in their spare time. And started to, talk to different organizations, linked up with an organization called the LA Clean Tech Incubator, started to train folks on how to fix charging stations, in a volunteer type space. And then I was trying to get those folks hired at companies, but no one wanted to directly hire field service talent. And so then one of the companies was like, what if you hired the field service folks and we hired you? And that's actually where it kind of started. So I feel like I stumbled into entrepreneurship, and yeah, that's what I've been up to.
Nice. That's very cool. And when it comes to the actual product or the solution that's being delivered, can you provide a bit more context on that?
Sure. So charging stations are computers. They are what we call IoT assets, Internet of Things. For fast chargers, there are many different what we call handshakes, which is essentially interoperability of software that has to properly work in order for one charging event to happen. Because this technology is new and there's a lot of new players, what we find is that oftentimes those handshakes fail and the stations do not work. So much so, there's actually a Wall Street Journal article that came out last week, and others as well, that they're seeing between 30 to 40% of the current infrastructure being inoperable. And a lot of the issues is because of these failures of handshakes. And so at ChargerHelp, what we believe is that, you can get field service data, you can troubleshoot, but you can collect the steps that you did when you tried to fix a problem. You could bring that problem into a system alongside other data sets, and you could start uncovering what's happening when the stations don't properly work. And then more importantly, you can start predicting when you think an issue is going to happen. And then if an issue does occur, you can actually solve it a lot faster. So we sell something called reliability as a service. Essentially, it's a fixed cost O&M. We utilize a lot of data in order to solve problems really quickly and sometimes even prevent someone going on site. We've done about 18,000 field service interactions in the last couple of years and continue to build out our database and our predictive analytics work.
Just to visualize this space, how many roughly EV charging stations are there in the United States?
I would say for charging manufacturers, I would say core probably about 5 or 6 large brands. And then 3 that probably has most of the market. And then for software providers, there's probably about 3 or so large software providers. And what ends up happening is a lot of people just white label existing software and existing hardware. But when you get down to it, it's a pretty fixed number of hardware providers and software providers. But everyone for the software side, they all utilize a core protocol called Open Charge Point Protocol. So that's what kind of like makes everything a little bit easier to understand and to troubleshoot.
That makes sense. And when you're looking at the stations that you serve, then is this all B2B or are some of these consumers sometimes?
So as of today, we're all B2B. We work primarily with utilities. We work with fleet operators, cities, and then larger kind of like resellers that are reselling to small businesses. So we are definitely in the B2B space.
And is that like a new revenue line item that small businesses are embracing to say, okay, I can set up a few of these charging stations and it's a way to drive more revenue? Or what's like that business model for these charging stations?
Sure. Yes. So for small businesses, we're seeing even multi-unit dwellings, workplaces. A lot of folks are seeing having charging stations as an amenity. And so they're investing in charging infrastructure. But then you do have a lot of businesses, actually larger scale businesses, where greenhouse gas reduction, things around climate are impacting how they think about their fleets. And so they're electrifying their fleets and then right haphazardly having to install charging infrastructure.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. And can you tell us anything about traction, adoption, any numbers that you can share?
Sure. I guess the biggest set of numbers is that, year over year, we've seen very impressive growth. We are currently servicing stations across 17 states. That 18,000 field service interactions, that is the largest set of field service interactions that there are in the US across multiple different manufacturers and network providers. And just really been proud of the team to see month over month revenue growth.
What do you attribute to that success? I'm sure any founder that's listening in would want to come on and say that as well about their company, but a lot of companies aren't growing right now and a lot of companies are struggling. What do you think you've gotten right?
It's timing. It's like the one thing you can't control. Like, when we first started the company, no one really cared about operations and maintenance of charging infrastructure. But we've seen this huge switch within our industry. And then what we did influence, though, were laws. So we were able to, co-sponsor a bill called the EV Charging Reliability Act in California. So that's giving the legislative body more insight and understanding of charging uptime. We were also able to, advocate for a guideline in the new federal funding for there to be 97% uptime. So I guess we have been doing a lot from a legislative perspective, but I think the one thing that, has worked out really well for us is timing.
Did you have to hire a lobbyist or were you doing that yourself when it comes to influencing the laws and the bills that were passed?
Yeah, it's a great question. So my first hire actually was government relations. And then we joined two core associations that already had lobbyists. And so then that way we didn't have to have a direct expense of a lobbyist. There are two states that we ended up hiring lobbyists, but that was later on. But our initial strategy was to work alongside the industry that aligned with our same values and then utilize, those larger organizations to help, lobby on our behalf.
I spoke with the founder earlier today, actually, and they were telling me that their first hire was a general counsel and their investors are like, are you crazy? That's your first hire? So when you told investors or when you were having conversations with investors and told them that the first hire was going to be government relations, did they think you were crazy or did it make sense given the business that you're in?
They say either you're really smart or really dumb. I guess we'll see. And we've passed one bill, another bill is gonna get signed by the governor. And we did really well. And so they're proud that I made that decision. But no, they were definitely on the fence, like, what the heck are you doing? But in climate is different. That's why I try to explain to folks, like, in climate, you will get squashed by laws in climate tech. So like you have to be prepared for that.
That makes sense. Yeah, I feel like there's probably a lot of stories of startups that just get crushed, right? Or just to get killed by regulation.
Yes, absolutely.
This show is brought to you by Frontlines Media, a podcast production studio that helps B2B founders launch, manage, and grow their own podcast. Now, if you're a founder, you may be thinking, I don't have time to host a podcast. I've got a company to build. Well, that's exactly what we built our service to do. You show up and host, and we handle literally everything else. To set up a call to discuss launching your own podcast, visit frontlines.io/podcast. Now, back to today's episode. Now, let's talk a little bit about messaging and positioning. So how has your messaging and positioning evolved since you launched the company?
It's interesting because we've always had to be education first, right? Because a lot of folks are like, what, charging stations break? And then they were like, well, isn't it an electrical problem? So a lot of what we've had to do is like, utilize our platform to bring data to the industry so folks can better understand the problem and then better understand our solution. So that's been the biggest, messaging. I think how it's evolved is the nuances that we can talk about. Now we can talk more about like handshake failures, interoperability issues. But in the beginning, I had to spend a lot of time showing the industry that the stations didn't work. But now that's picked up and there's more articles about it, more people talking about it. And so now, our next kind of like messaging strategy is like, okay, now that you know that it doesn't work, here are the complexities. And then two, once again, here's how we can, be helpers in solving it.
Now, another founder described it to me as they spent the first few years of the company really trying to create demand and educate the market about the problem and aggravate that problem so that they would want to solve it. And then the next phase for them was about capturing that demand. And when they were trying to capture that demand, what they found was there was a lot more competition all of a sudden, largely because of their work. They were, competing with companies to capture demand. Is that something you've experienced as well? Was this kind of this lonely journey at first where there was no one really talking about this problem and now there's more people talking about it? Or is it really still just you talking about this problem and you capturing that demand?
So there's now more people talking about it, but they were talking about it how we were talking about it a year ago, right? And so now we're in this new lonely space where we're explaining the nuances of it because we have the largest data set to explain it. So it's interesting because, yeah, like people talk about it more. There's way more people that say they can fix chargers, but then a lot of those folks don't understand like what it takes. And then the industry is still catching up to understanding what it takes, right? So it's interesting. The thing is that I guess that makes it still a compelling problem to solve is because there's so much government funding in this space. And most importantly, there's so much private sector funding from car OEMs who've made commitments, to electricity and electrification. So it still makes it a compelling, problem to solve. But it is funny that we just go from, another set of education.
Yeah, I feel like it never ends, right?
Yeah.
Now, I saw that you were also mentioned in a White House press release celebrating, I believe it was just the progress or the network being built for EV chargers in America. What was that like being featured in that? And what impact did it have on the company?
Yeah. So the White House press release was actually because we partner with the organization called SAE International.
Mhm.
And that organization, they're the ones that help like the automotive industry and also the airline industry with a lot of standards. And so they actually are putting together the first ever EVSC technician certification program. So prior to our company starting, there was no job title called EVSC technician. We actually created that job title with the Department of Labor. And then we needed an organization to essentially say, stamp of approval of this person knows how to fix a charging station. And so we had created a curriculum on our own, but then SAE took our curriculum and then worked with some of the other industry folks to add on to it to now create this body of knowledge that was released. And now in Q1, people can go and sit for a test to become a certified EVSE technician. And so for us to get recognized for that work was huge because we really needed to create a workforce, in our industry. We're a technology company. We're not a service company. We had to hire field service technicians and train them on their own because that labor force did not exist, right? And so it's really cool stepping into next year where there will now be certified folks that can do this work, right? And so that way we can further move into being a full technology company and not having so much physical service that we're responsible for.
Mm, that makes a lot of sense. Now, did you feel like you had product market fit right away when you were first launching in 2020, or did it take some time for you to really feel that way?
I mean, I feel like it took some time. I think we're just at the cusp of it right now, like strong product market fit. I think, in the beginning, the customers that were experiencing the most pain understood like our product and it made sense to them. But a lot of folks didn't really, wasn't experiencing tremendous pain yet, right? Because they didn't have enough stations deployed, or if the station broke, they really weren't really responsible. But now with the new legislation coming into play, it's forcing people to deal with this, which we should have been dealing with it because it's such a waste of funding to deploy assets. And, 30 to 40% of them don't work. Like, well, that's crazy. So I think we're at the really cusp of it right now for more of a mass space. But people who've had charging infrastructure, I feel as though we fit very well for them.
As I mentioned there in the intro, you've raised over 20 million to date. What have you learned about fundraising throughout this journey?
That you have to have customers. I mean, I think the thing that's crazy to me is like a lot of folks, they raise so much capital and then they have no revenue or they don't have a strong, understanding of like their customer. And I think for us, which has been good, is that when we've gone out to fundraise, we've always had, solid traction, right? We've always been able to show what exactly we needed the funding to hit the next growth phase. And on those in between, we've done 3 rounds. On those in between rounds, we were able to show, that we hit the milestones that we set off before. So it's really like, one, making sure you have customers, making sure people are paying you, that you show you have traction, and then being like super, super clear on like if you get a new inflection of capital, what will that mean? What will those milestones be? And then when you hit those things and you do have to go out again, you can point to and say, hey, you gave me X, I did this, and then that allows people to, trust you. And of course, nothing is going to be perfect. It's all very hard. But that's what I really just try to strive for, is making sure I have customers and that we're hitting our milestones before we ever go out to fundraise.
Are you still involved in every deal that closes, or have you managed to transition out of founder-led sales?
I am out of founder-led sales. It's really sad because, I really like talking to customers. And so sometimes, I ask if I can be included because I like to talk about customers.
I've heard founders say something very similar, and they've also said that it's just really hard. And that's why I wanted to ask about that is, they've told me that it's just extremely difficult when you make that transition out of sales. Was that difficult for you, or was that easy to navigate?
It was easy because like my SVP of sales is really, really smart and a lot smarter than me. And so, I felt very comfortable having her own that space. So yeah, that part was easy for me. It's just, yeah, I just try to stay close to our product and stay close to the customers just so, one, you always want to make sure that the thing that you were selling in the beginning is still the thing that you're selling now that you have more people. And then two, it's just helpful to hear, how we're still solving a really big problem for people in the industry.
Amazing. Now, final question for you. Let's zoom out 3 to 5 years into the future. What's the big picture vision that you're building here?
Yeah, at ChargerHelp, what we're really trying to build, actually, I'll explain the bigger problem, which is fascinating. So today, if you drive an electric vehicle and you need to go to a charging station, you typically use your electric vehicle will tell you what's the nearest available charging station. What we see time and time again is because that vehicle is relying on station data, and the station data is typically saying, oh, I'm available. But when that driver gets to that station, the station is actually broken. And so we see that the information that comes off the charging station is not right. And that has all to do with like what we were talking about earlier, like handshakes and discrepancies in how the station is actually understanding itself. And so we believe that if we get enough data, that we can be a verification system for those car OEMs. And even as the federal government starts to roll out more regulation on uptime, right, we can verify, oh, that station actually is working, right? And so that's where we see ourselves really within the next year or two, where we actually have a strategic round open right now to bring forth some of our product roadmap. But that's one of the newest features that we're building towards, is to have a verification tool for the charging infrastructure, which then, as you have more smart technology, smart cities, and you have more softwares interacting with the built environment, you can utilize the same type of framework to understand, is this, IoT asset, is it behaving as intended? So yeah, that's what we're working towards right now.
Amazing. Well, I love the vision. I love everything that you're building, and I've really enjoyed this conversation. I know it's going to be a real hit with our audience. Before we wrap here, if there's any founders that are listening in, they're inspired by your journey, and they just want to follow along as you continue to build and execute, where should they go?
Oh yeah, I am an unofficial LinkedIn influencer. So you can find me on LinkedIn. I like to share a lot of what we've been up to on my LinkedIn.
Amazing. We'll make sure to link to that in the show notes. Really appreciate you taking the time. Again, this is a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
All right, keep in touch. This episode of Category Visionaries is brought to you by Frontlines Media, Silicon Valley's leading podcast production studio. If you're a B2B founder looking for help launching and growing your own podcast, visit frontlines.io/podcast. And for the latest episode, search for Category Visionaries on your podcast platform of choice. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode.